Well, let me take this opportunity, 6 o'clock, according to my watch, to welcome you to GSW Third World in Perspective Program seminar this evening, which is Russia and the Near Abroad. And our two featured speakers are Dr. Parkinson here and Dr. Hall, both authorities on the subject. So we have some distinguished guests with us this evening. The president of the university, Dr. Blanchard, and his wife, Connie. Thank you for your attendance. And I want to thank Dr. Blanchard for his superlative leadership of this institution. There's a lot of things going on here, and not only the building, but a lot of very important academic activities. And our enrollment's up, and everything looks good. I know there's some problems. Still, I think he's done an amazing job. And this is echoed in the community. Usually several times a week people stop me and say, Dr. Blanchard is really a tremendous asset, not only to the university, but also to the community. And I don't believe we've ever had a time since I've been here when town and gown have been closer together. And I'm not going to say how long I've been here, but, a long time. So this series, as you know, started a long time ago, and we've continued it, and we all know it led, or some of us know it led to the Association of Third World Studies, and also the Journal of Third World Studies. But besides Dr. and Ms. Blanchard, we also have Mr. and Mrs. Jim Fabre from the Fuller Center for Housing, and they work there with the financial area, and also in just general work involved with building. As you know, Mildred Fuller passed away on February 3rd, and that was a tremendous loss. And he had been close to the university and the Third World Studies here at the university. But we all mourn his passing. It's a great loss. Incidentally, Mr. and Mrs. Fabre are going to the Bulgaria Maymester program with Dr. Smedra, and Dr. Hall is going to be involved in that also, teaching, I believe it's a history of the Balkans, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, we also have Dr. and Mrs. Augusto Lopez, who are old friends. Dr. Lopez was a pathologist here for many years, then retired here. He and Lillian hail from Colombia, so it fits in the Third World series very well. And so welcome all, including Boris Peltzberger, who I don't want to forget. He's a good colleague and the head of computer program here. And he's been here over 10 years. He hails from Russia originally, and his daughter, Svetlana is our webmaster. Now, I remember when we were looking for a webmaster, and I mentioned it to Boris, and Boris said, "Your problems are over." Well, that made me feel good. And she does an excellent job for us. But welcome. I'm sure this is going to be a very interesting program. I'm going to pass around this sign-up sheet so we know who's here, and I can give this to continuing education. My students, please fill out that participation form. And my students also, don't forget we got a test next week, April 1st, that goes that goes through George Washington's domestic administration. So I just wanted to remind you all of that. And, well, we have a very interesting program this evening. Our first speaker is Dr. Richard Hall, who's professor of history here, and he got his undergraduate degree at Vanderbilt University and his MA and PhD from Ohio State University, where he taught in addition to University of Nebraska and also Minnesota State University and the Air University over in Montgomery. He teaches a variety of courses specializing in Eastern and Central Europe. He's published 2 books, and he's got another one coming out shortly on the Balkans. He's published many articles, encyclopedias, and book reviews, and he's going to teach this history of the Balkans at the GSW Master Study Abroad program at the American University in Bulgaria, May 18th to June 10th. So Dr. Hall is going to speak on Russia and the Caucasus. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Dr. Isaacs, and the Third World Association for giving me the opportunity to talk. I always like to get a chance to ramble on for a while. Now, the topic here tonight is overall Russia and the near abroad, and I want to explain the meaning of this term, near abroad. Up until 1991, Russia was a part of a world empire called the Soviet Union. But in 1991, of the 15 constituent republics of this Soviet Union, 14 broke away from Russia and became independent states. These 14 republics now constitute what is known as the near abroad. Former members of the Soviet Union, which in the past, even going beyond the formation of the Soviet Union in 1921, had at one time or another been associated with Russia. So there's still a lot of ties involved here. Now, I'm going to address in particular 3 of those former Soviet republics, still very important constituents of this near abroad. These are Georgia, not the one on Ray Charles' mind, but the one at the eastern end of the Black Sea. Let me, I actually got a map here. Georgia, right here. Right here. Armenia, right here. And Azerbaijan here. Well, okay, let me just stop it right here for now. But the point I want to make first of all is to indicate just how diverse this region is. This entire region of Russia, the former Soviet Union, has incredible diversity in an area the size of the state of Minnesota. There is incredible topographical diversity. The land extends from sea level here to the Black Sea, up to the highest mountains in Europe. The highest peak in Europe is right about here, called Mount Elbrus, 18,500 feet, and there are at least 6 other peaks over 16,000 feet. By the way, this Mount Elbrus was so important that when the Nazis come into this area in 1942, one of the first things they did was send a team to climb Mount Elbrus, to be on top of the highest mountain in Europe, and to plant the swastika flag. Went all over German newspapers when that happened. Now, not just that, again, the climate is incredibly diverse. Coffee is grown in this region of the Black Sea. But there's permanent snow cover on those mountains. And now we get into the real complexity. Look at these different colors here. These are indicative of the ethnic groups in this region. There are over 50 languages spoken in this region. Again, the size of Minnesota. Some of them they come from almost any family. Armenian, for instance, is an Indo-European language, like most of the other European languages. Many of these other languages here are of Turkish origin. Azerbaijani is Turkish. But there are a number of ones that don't fit into any category at all. Georgian here is unique. There are languages here, Chechen. It's not related to anything. Well, it's related to English. There's Mongol, spoken up there in Kalmykia. And there are a number of languages, linguists, ethnicists don't know what they are. We got complex culture as well. The Georgians here are Orthodox Christians. The Armenians, Monophysite Christians. They're Christians who reject the idea of the Trinity. The Azerbaijanis are Sunni Muslims. The Kalmyks are Buddhists. Again, incredibly complex region. And this complexity has been throughout history an important basis for conflict in this region. Now, here in a geopolitical sense, what we've got in this region here is the coming together of the Eurasian, I should say, land mass, extending all the way from the Pacific Ocean here to the Netherlands, with Asia Minor. And one of the reasons for this ethnic, linguistic complexity is that over the centuries, lots of different kinds of peoples have passed from the east to the west, and they've found refuge in the valleys and heights of the Caucasus Mountains. Now, in a more clearly historical sense, there's a pattern of three big empires coming together in this region. The actual composition of those empires has changed over the centuries. At one time, the empire here was Rome, in the southwest was Rome, and then it's Byzantium, and then it's the Ottoman Empire, and in modern times it's Turkey. Generally here to the southeast, it's been some kind of empire associated with Persia or Iran. And the one to the north has changed many times over the centuries. In ancient times, it was the Scythicans. In early Christian times, it was the Khazars, the Mongols here in the Middle Ages. And the Russians have only arrived in this region here in modern times. The Russians only make it down to the Caucasus at the end of the 18th century, at about the year 1800. And they found that this complexity afforded them an opportunity to intervene, to become involved. In fact, the Russians were invited into this region in 1801 by one of the principalities in Georgia. The Georgians, again, Orthodox Christians like the Russians, were tired of having to fight the Muslim Turks, the Sunni Muslim Turks, and tired of having to fight the Shia Muslim Persians. So they asked the Russians to come in and save them. And this 1801, the first Russian forces crossed the Caucasus and take over Georgia. And from there, through the 19th century, Russian control will expand down into Armenia, over into Azerbaijan. They encounter considerable resistance from a number of these people, especially from the Muslim peoples of the Caucasus. Famously, there's the chieftain Shamil, who fought against the Russians until his capture in 1859. He's a hero for many of these Caucasus peoples today. Now, towards the end of the 19th century, something real important happened in this area that fixed the Russians on wanting to control it. Right here, at the eastern end of this land bridge between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, right here around Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, were found huge deposits of oil. Now, Russia's not yet seriously industrialized at the end of the 19th century, but if they're going to industrialize, they've got to exploit that oil. So, this becomes for Russia a position of great importance. They've got to hang on to Azerbaijan. But then they get involved in the First World War, and they don't do so well. Fighting occurs all around in here. And in particular, the Armenians suffer a terrible catastrophe. 1 million Armenians are murdered by Ottoman authorities in 1915. So the turbulence of this region still continues on. Now Russia collapses into revolution, and briefly from 1918 to 1921, this Caucasus region became independent. An independent state of Georgia, an independent state of Armenia, and an independent state of Azerbaijan. But the Red Army, having succeeded in winning the Russian Civil War, having succeeded in imposing a communist government excuse me, on Russia, entered the region in 1921 and conquered it for what would become the Soviet Union. Now, just a little bit more history and we'll get to contemporary issues. In World War II, it gets to be important again, and the Germans are determined to get here, because if they're able to take this oil, then they'll have enough oil to fight the war, and the Russians won't. So the big thrust of the German drive to the east is aimed at getting to Baku. And when they come down into this region, some people, some of these diverse peoples up in the mountains, they greet the Germans as liberators. One group of people, the Balkirs, send Hitler a white horse. But the German presence here is brief. As you all know, up here to the north, about 200 miles, the Germans will suffer a catastrophic defeat in January 1943 at Stalingrad. And they have to pull out. And when they pull out, and the Soviet authorities come back, the Soviet authorities wreak vengeance on those people they thought were traitors. A number of these groups here, the Chechens here, the English here, the Balkirs here, the Kalmucks up there, are deported en masse to Siberia for being traitors. All the people are rounded up. Of course, this is not done in optimum conditions. They're not sent in luxury coaches to Siberia. So, from a quarter to a third of the people die. Now, getting up to present day, because of a number of inherent problems, the Soviet Union tottered from the 1980s to 1991 and then collapsed. This enabled these three states here. Let's go over to this other map so we can change in scenery. Okay. These three states, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, to become independent. But what about these people up here? Do they get to be independent? And are these people all comfortable with their borders? Well, they're not. Fighting begins almost immediately. One place of fighting is right here, a location called Nagorno-Karabakh. The people who live there are Armenian, but it's in Azerbaijan. So fighting begins there about 1991 and goes to 1995. Another place Chechnya, up here. Remember, the Russians deported them back in 1943 and 1944. The survivors were permitted to return in the late 50s. Now they don't want to be part of Russia. Another place fighting begins. Here in Georgia, Ossetia and Abkhazia. Now, for the Russians, this fighting provides some opportunity. The Russians were very much want to maintain a presence in this region. Why? Well, one reason is because being across the barrier of the mountains puts them in a position to have a presence in the Middle East. Puts them in a position to have a presence at the big oil areas that serve the oil for the Europe, for the U.S., for Japan. I'm not saying the Russians want to take these areas over. I'm not saying they have conquest on their minds, but certainly being proximate to these regions gives them some advantages. Another reason they want to be over the mountains here. Pipelines. There is a tremendous flow of natural gas. There are big natural gas fields across the Caspian Sea in what's another state of the near abroad, one that Dr. Parkinson's going to talk here about in a minute, Turkmenistan. This is what heats the homes of Europe, and the pipeline comes through here. This enables the Russians to put their thumb on this vital natural resource. Also, Azerbaijani oil coming through this region. Again, the Russians can put their thumb on it. Now, why do they care about Chechnya? Well, other pipelines go here to the north. And so the Russians fight in Chechnya from 1994 to 1999, and again from 2001 to 2003. They finally have imposed, after a great deal of brutality on both sides, they finally imposed a kind of thugocracy in Chechnya. Another reason the Russians want to have a presence here is because the Georgians have elected a pro-American president named Mikhail Saakashvili. And he has indicated a desire to join NATO. Well, the Russians do not want NATO on their southern frontier. They react to that the same way Americans do to Cuba's recent invitation to invite the Russian fleet and the Russian Air Force back to Cuba. So last summer we saw that the Russians administered a sharp rebuff to Georgia by fighting here in this enclave of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. By the way, the reason South Ossetia is really so important is because the only Transcaucasian tunnel, the only direct road through the mountains, goes through here. Now, let me suggest one more reason why the Russians are eager at this point to maintain a presence in this region. A more limited, a more personal reason. In 2012, the Winter Olympic Games are to be held right up in the upper corner of this map, at a Black Sea resort called Sochi. This is the personal project of the Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. And he doesn't want this to get screwed up. He doesn't want some Chechen terrorists or some Georgian fanatics to rain on his, or I guess he'd want him to snow on the Olympics, not rain on it. So, we want to keep this area calm. Now, one more overview of this. Georgia, hostile to the Russians. Armenia, pro-Russian. The Russians helped them against Nagorno-Karabakh, the Russians are guarantees against the Turks. And Azerbaijan, well, they got a lot of connections to Turkey, so it's not clear where they're going. This area is not going to calm down anytime soon. It's going to be one of turbulence. It has been throughout its history. I suspect, again, in the next couple of years, next 3 years, because of these Olympics, we're going to see more things going on here. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. Excellent presentation. One of my other colleagues I forgot to introduce, Brian Smith, right here is a political scientist who's participated frequently and will continue, hopefully, to participate in programs. Our next speaker is going to talk about Russia and Central Asia, Dr. Brian Parkinson. He came here in 2005 to be in the history department. He received his BA from Georgia Southern University and his MA and PhD degrees in Middle Eastern history from Florida State University, where he taught. He also, before coming here, taught in the Florida State's London Center. He teaches a variety of courses on the Third World, Middle East, Africa, Asia. His research interests are Middle Eastern nationalism and intellectual history. He's published in several scholarly journals, including Journal of Third World Studies and World History Bulletin. He's also been a Fulbright Scholar to South Africa. And Brian is going to talk about Russia and Central Asia. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Parkinson.
Thank you, Dr. Isaacs. I'd like to thank all of y'all for coming out, and thank you, Dr. Isaacs, for continuing this program, this seminar in Third World Studies. Let me just pull up this PowerPoint real quick for y'all. All right, so what I want to do is kind of go over the independence, how Central Asian states, formerly Soviet Central Asian states, how they became independent. And let's first start out with Gorbachev. That's this handsome gentleman here, yeah, Mr. Gorbie. Gorbachev inherited the rolling purges and the anti-corruption campaigns that had been instituted in Central Asia under the likes of Khrushchev and continued through guys like Brezhnev. However, Gorbie will expand the purging of corrupt officials, corrupt Communist Party officials in Central Asia in his anti-corruption campaigns, and he will attempt to strengthen Moscow's grip and authority over Central Asia. He was very much of a centralizer and a reformer. However, he will eventually give up this process or give up these attempts by 1989 when he realizes that he is unable to affect change the way he wants to in Soviet Central Asia. All right, so let's move on and first talk about Gorbie and Islam. All right. In another parallel with Khrushchev, Gorbie was a reformer in most areas, but unlike Khrushchev was anti-Islam, but not to the same extent that Gorbie was. Gorbie will ratchet up the anti-Islam campaign of the Soviet Union in Central Asia. All right. For example, in a 1986 speech in Uzbekistan, and I will reference Uzbekistan probably the most in this lecture, in this speech today, because Uzbekistan is the most populous state in Soviet Central Asia. He called for a renewed struggle against religious manifestations. He asked Soviet Central Asians to concentrate on work and atheism. All right. So this is part of his renewal of an atheist campaign. All right, and he, in the same speech, this very same speech, he criticized those who only paid lip service to Communist Party ideals. All right, for those who belong to the Communist Party in Uzbekistan, the Uzbek Communist Party, he tightened the requirements on atheism. He didn't want Islam penetrating into the Communist Party. And so he attempted to purge those officials who really weren't atheists but might claim to do so, but privately they were Muslim. All right. However, over the years, his warning lost force. Part of the reason is that most Muslim Soviet Central Asians thought that Gorbie and the Russian Soviets had a double standard when it came to Islam. For example, they said that he held up Christianity as a positive force in Europe, whereas he held up Islam in Central Asia as a negative force. All right, so many people like the Uzbeks, they protested such attacks on Islam as a revolutionary or reactionary force. All right, and when with Glasnost the openness campaign, he will more Soviet Central Asians will be able to criticize his anti-Islam policies. All right, let's talk about the impact of his purges on Soviet Central Asia. And by the way, you can tell the Soviet official Soviet states, modern Central Asia, and UNESCO's definition of Central Asia on this map. All right, so in terms of the purges, tens of thousands in each of the Soviet Central Asian states lost party members, Communist Party members, in these purges. He also instituted a propaganda campaign against Islam in Soviet Central Asian states. However, his propaganda campaign in Soviet Central Asia against Islam had a negative and deleterious effect on his policies. For example, it led to many in Soviet Central Asia feeling discomfort and unease with the way that the Soviets were, trying to separate your Muslim or Central Asian identity from your communist identity. All right, so this just led to more resentment. Many of the people of these Central Asian states felt that the Soviets were picking on their national pride. They associated being Muslim with being Kazakh, being Muslim with being Uzbek. And so if you attacked their religion, you were attacking their national pride. All right. And so what was the outcome of this? Well, it led to many nationalist expressions and more Islamist opposition. Many men started growing their beards as a symbol of Islam and a symbol of how they felt about the government's anti-Islam campaigns. Women started covering up as a way to assert their Islamic identity. And there is a Soviet survey from 1987 that was conducted in Uzbekistan that was quite interesting. And this survey was of Uzbek undergrads. And they found out, according to this survey, that 60% of these Uzbek undergrads identified themselves as Muslim. And only 7% identified themselves as atheist. And I'm sure some identified themselves as Russian because there is a Russian minority in each one of these states. But this shocked the party officials because most of these party officials, they had thought that only the old people were religious, okay? They thought they had, made it through to that younger generation. And so this was very demoralizing for them because they thought that the younger generation, the youngsters were truly or completely Sovietized, all right? But what's amazing is that these kids that had said that they were communist, they also said that they were Islamic, also said they were communist. They didn't see a problem being both Muslim and communist. However, the government in Moscow felt like that was a problem. All right. So there is a religious revival taking place in Central Asia. And this religious revival that's taking place in Central Asia in the 1990s is taking place alongside massive population growth. Soviet Central Asia sees 50% population growth in the 1990s. All right, this tremendously worries Moscow. All right, they are worried that the merchants, the Bazari, are coming under greater Islamic or Islamist influence, and they worry that they are losing their economic grip on these upper class or business types. They're worried that these merchants are reestablishing their old Islamic trading routes and traditional links. All right, so they're worried about the reestablishment of trade between reestablishment of links of trade between merchants and Islam. Furthermore, waqf money, and waqf, in case you're interested, is pronounced waqf with a kind of a swallowed Q, and that's W-A-Q-F, and it's a religious foundation, an Islamic religious foundation. The money that's being given to these religious foundations is increasing during the 1990s. All right. Why is this taking place? Because of perestroika. Perestroika, or a restructuring of the Soviet Union, is taking place under Gorbie, and they're allowing these new organizations to have greater freedoms, and people are starting to donate new money to rebuild mosques. I mean, these are the same mosques that Gorbie had tried to turn into community centers. He wanted these good Muslims to be having dances in these mosques, like you would at a YMCA or something. All right. So what all this leads to is greater and greater opposition to Moscow. A great example of this opposition is that the Mufti of Tashkent will be driven from his office. The reason why is because the people protested him as a Communist Party lackey. They saw the Mufti as someone who was not really a good Muslim, and they gave reasons such as, for example, he drank alcohol, he mixed with women, and most importantly, he refused to approve a final or new translation of the Quran. All right, and so they thought, this guy just is, a puppet, a Moscow puppet. All right, and so these demonstrations, popular demonstrations, will increase. People are pushing for more and more during this period. Next, we have a meeting at Tashkent University in December of 1988. At this meeting is called by Uzbek students who are quite nationalist. This meeting is for the express purpose of honoring the Uzbek language. All right, so there's a nationalist tinge there, and the honor of the attempt to honor the Uzbek language turns into a forum for Uzbek nationalism. Students call for Uzbek to be the national language of Uzbekistan. No, it was not. Russian was. This is all very Islamic in connotation. They recite Islamic Quran verses. They recite surahs from the Quran. They are displaying the green flag of Islam all at this meeting. They're associating Islam with Uzbek pride, with Uzbek nationalism. All right. At the same time, the economy is plunging. In terms of unemployment is up to 27% at this time, and things are getting worse. And when the economy fails, people don't want to blame themselves. It's never your fault. Like when I was a kid, when I got in trouble, I never wanted to take the blame. I said, hey, what about my brother? My mom would always say, we're not talking about your brother. We're talking about you. And these Uzbek Turks will take the opportunity to blame Meskhetian Turks, who are a slightly different ethnic Turkic group. All right. During this time, Meskhetian Turks are targeted as scapegoats by Uzbek gangs. They will these Uzbek gangs burn the homes of 160,000 Meskhetian Turks, forcing them to flee and find refuge and sanctuary elsewhere. And so Gorbie is trying to find a solution during this period. All right? He tries to find a solution, and one of the solutions that he comes up with is replacing the head of the Uzbek Communist Party with a new guy, Islam Karimov. All right? And the reason why he chose Islam Karimov is Islam Karimov, this gentleman here, had an Islamic legacy. He had a Muslim background. So you can see here that Gorbie is trying to placate the Uzbek nationalists. All right, this was a guy who was born in 1938 in Samarkand. He was a graduate of the Polytechnic University and a longtime member of the Communist Party. As a matter of fact, he was actually a Central Committee member in Moscow. And what does he do as soon as he takes power? He acts with a firm hand. The first thing that he does is he bans all public meetings. He wants no further protests, no further demonstrations. He wants people to calm down. All right? And then he begins to slow down the democratic process because he thought the democratic process in Central Asia had unleashed these waves of violence against people like the Meskhetian Turks. All right? His main opposition at this time is a party known as Birlik. Birlik means unity. It's a Turkic word. All right? And Birlik is the main Uzbek opposition party to Moscow. And Birlik is nationalist. They are an Uzbek nationalist party. All right? And they have three main points to their platform. Firstly, democracy. Second, nationalism. And thirdly, economic liberalization. Those are their three main points: democracy, nationalism, and economic liberalization. And they get these points from the Baltics, those Baltic states like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. They're following those Baltic states. Those Baltic states are way more progressive, farther ahead in terms of trying to break away from the Soviet Union than the Central Asian states are. So how does Islam Karimov react to Birlik? He co-opts them. He takes their message and makes it their own, thereby taking the wind out of their sails. All right? So he harnesses the Birlik party for his own political purposes, and then he turns on Moscow himself and blames Moscow for all of Uzbekistan's economic problems. Isn't that the same thing that Birlik was doing? Why, yes, it was. So let's move on and talk about the demise of these states, because this is what's going to bring us up to where we are today. This is important, and we're going to see two different groups of states in Central Asia leaving the USSR for two different reasons. All right? Many of the leaders, the leadership of the Soviet Central Asian states, did not want the USSR to collapse. They feared the demise of the USSR. This is very much unlike the Baltics, who kind of wanted the demise of the USSR. All right? These guys, they did not want independence for a couple important reasons. First of all, they felt like they were too far behind in terms of modernization. They hadn't caught up with the likes of East Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, who were much better off than these guys. And secondly, these guys did a kind of cost-benefit analysis, and they looked at the numbers and they said, wait, we give less money to Moscow than Moscow returns to us. So isn't it better for us to stay as we are? Okay. And so, but what ultimately happens is they are decolonized basically by default. They accept decolonization by default. They were essentially clinging on to Gorbachev. So independence for them was kind of thrust upon them. They weren't agitating for independence like those in the Baltics. All right. By 1990, all of the Central Asian republics made declarations of sovereignty. Now, when I say sovereignty, that is not necessarily saying declarations of independence. Two different things. What they did say, though, in terms of their declarations of sovereignty, is the primacy of local laws over Soviet laws. Local laws for them were more important than Soviet laws. Secondly, they wanted more control over their own resources. They wanted more control over their own resources and their own domestic policy. So remember, this is not independence. They're not necessarily looking to sever the relationship with Moscow. They're basically following in the wake of other republics that are declaring their independence in Eastern Europe. Okay? They thought the prospect for their own independence as something remote. Okay? And their presidents didn't necessarily want total sovereignty. Let's move on and talk about the Congress of People's Deputies. In terms of the 1989 elections, Central Asian candidates ran unopposed. These men were old-style communists. They were not very democratic. They were very loyal to Gorbachev. Okay. In terms of the new Union Treaty, Gorbie was pressured to create a new Union Treaty that recognized that the republics had not chosen to freely be in the USSR. Okay? So if these new Central Asian states wanted to sign a treaty with Russia, that was their own choice. They could do that of their own free will. All right? This new Union Treaty was heavily opposed by conservatives, conservative old guard communists. A lot of people in the KGB were very much against this, as well as some generals. They feared that if the Soviets broke away, so too would the whole USSR. Gorbie at this time had gone too far for the conservatives, and by 1991 they will attempt a coup. All right? In 3 days, they tried to convince everyone that they were in control. The coup collapsed, and so did the USSR. So let's move on to the post-coup and talk about George Bush's best friend there, Ahmadinejad. All right, okay. So let's talk about the post-coup period. You have two groups of people. One group are the Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Turkmens. The leaders of these three states did not oppose the coup. They just followed it and accepted wherever things were going. So by doing so, they were basically accepting the coup in a way. All right, they were playing follow the leader. All right. Meanwhile, the Kyrgyz and the Kazakhs actively rejected the coup. They moved to ratify the new Union Treaty and recognized Gorbachev. All right. These Central Asian states wanted to remain in this USSR. They wanted to continue the USSR. Again, because they were on the receiving end of Soviet benefits. So the Central Asian republics of the USSR were the last ones to sever their links with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Let's talk about some of these states. First of all, Kazakhstan. When the USSR broke up, Kazakhstan was one of the world's largest nuclear powers. Kazakhstan realized they didn't have the means, whether it be economic or whatever, to take care of these nukes. Kazakhstan was the largest nuclear power after the breakup of the USSR, and the president of Kazakhstan made a decision that they could not afford to keep the nukes. So they were going to denuclearize, if you will. So someone else had to pick up the tab for that. Who was going to pick up the tab for disarming Kazakhstan? The United States did. Russia also helped. The weapons-grade radioactive material, that went to the United States for reprocessing. It actually went to Oak Ridge for reprocessing, and the delivery systems went to Russia. All right? And what did Kazakhstan get out of this? Cash. We paid them to disarm, and they took the money. All right. Let's talk about what happens with the Uzbeks, the Turkmens, and the Tajiks, that first group. In order to preserve the status quo, they thought they should go independent to save themselves from post-collapse reform. So these three states are rather conservative in their independence. The Uzbeks, the Turkmens, and the Tajiks, they say, let's go independent rather than have reform. Okay? On the other hand, and I'll end with this, the Kyrgyz and the Kazakhs, they wanted independence because they were worried, what if the hardliners, what if the old guard come back? So they say, let's reserve the gains we've gotten before the communist hardliners take power again. And so they go independent for more progressive or liberal reasons. All right. Any questions? I guess I'll hand the floor back over to Dr. Isaacs, and we'll answer questions.
Thank you. That was superlative. Do you have any questions? Must be some questions, all this information. Brian?
My question is motivated based on the World War I genocide of Armenians. I know it's a touchy subject for Turkey and Armenia. Turkey has got laws against talking about it, and I know every Armenian I've met that is still producing a lot of nationalistic anger concerning that. Given the close ties, relative, I guess, the historical and cultural ties, if not current ties, between Azerbaijan and Turkey, what is the current relationship between Armenia and Azerbaijan like, given this tension with the Sunni Muslims?
It's at present, the relationship between Azerbaijan and Armenia is an armistice. They have not resolved the Nagorno-Karabakh issue. The Armenians continue to rely on Russia for arms and military advice. But within the past year or so, there's been some movement between the Ankara government, Turkey, and Yerevan, Armenia, to begin to talk and possibly to open up their frontier. The Armenian-Turkish frontier is closed now, but it'd be mutually beneficial to begin to economic interaction. There's also been, within the past year or so, an admission by some Turks that maybe they did misbehave a little bit in Armenia. So this is perhaps this issue starting to thaw out a little bit.
Any other questions? That's it? Okay, well. Oh, Dr. Blanchard? Yes.
It's a more immediate issue. The discussions between the U.S. and Russia about the missile defense system in Europe, the recent discussions suggesting that the Russians may be willing to swap, make deals, pull out of, quit supplying around military equipment. What's the latest on all of that? Where do you think that's going?
Well, yeah. Recently, the Obama administration has indicated that it's not interested in any kind of quick establishment of this missile defense system in the Czech Republic and Poland. So they've backed off a little bit. There's no assurance, by the way, that the Czech Republic especially will accept these installations. And so in that circumstance, the Russians have ceased to be so strident about the establishment of this circumstance. Now, the ability of the Russians to influence Iran in these circumstances is at best limited anyway, as the Iranians are not just dependent on the Russians for their military hardware. So that's kind of a dubious issue. But the whole situation seems to have at least for the time being, calmed down, because mainly of Obama's disinterest in pursuing this right now.
Any possibility of a connection between the less strident attitude and the lower price of oil?
I'm sure it's not just coincidence. Lots of things come back to oil.
Okay, well, let me take this opportunity to thank you for your presence and attention, and I want to thank the speakers. Both gave excellent presentations. So, good evening. Thank you very much.
This is GSW TV, your campus and community connection.